There are moments in life when silence becomes louder than confrontation, when distance speaks more clearly than explanation, and when your absence begins to echo in places where your presence was once taken for granted, and in those moments what feels like rejection, isolation, or even abandonment is often something far more divine unfolding behind the scenes, because when God removes you from someone's life, it is rarely about punishment and almost always about revelation, and while you may sit wondering why they suddenly grew cold, why they stopped valuing what you brought, or why doors you tried so hard to keep open were quietly shut, God may be using the very space created by your absence to teach them lessons they refused to learn while you were still there holding everything together. Sometimes people only recognize light after it is gone, they only understand loyalty after betrayal replaces it. They only appreciate gentleness after harshness becomes their daily reality, and they only understand the blessing they once had when it is no longer available to them. And this is not about revenge or pride or proving a point, this is about divine timing, divine correction, and divine growth. Because there are seasons where your presence shielded them from the consequences of their own immaturity, and there are seasons where your prayers covered them even when they did not respect you. But when God decides it is time for someone to grow, He will remove the cushion, He will remove the comfort, He will remove the familiar support system, and suddenly they must face themselves without the benefit of your patience, your kindness, your forgiveness, or your constant reassurance, and that is when realization begins to bloom slowly and painfully, like a truth that cannot be ignored anymore. You may feel misunderstood right now, you may feel like you were the only one fighting for the connection, like you were the one investing emotionally, spiritually, and mentally while they coasted on your effort, but understand this deeply. God sees the imbalance even when others deny it. God sees the tears you cried in silence, the compromises you made to keep peace, the times you swallowed your hurt to avoid conflict. And when He decides enough is enough, He will orchestrate separation not to break you but to teach them what your presence truly meant. Absence has a way of exposing value, and what familiarity numbed, distance revives. Because when you are constantly available, people assume you will always be there. When you constantly forgive, they assume forgiveness is automatic. When you constantly show up, they assume showing up requires no sacrifice. But once you step back, once you stop explaining, once you stop chasing, once you stop proving your worth, a vacuum forms, and in that vacuum clarity begins to grow. And the same person who once overlooked you may find themselves replaying conversations in their mind, remembering small gestures they once dismissed, realizing how safe they felt around you, realizing how rare your consistency was, realizing that not everyone carries the same heart, and that is when the lesson begins. God often teaches through contrast. He allows people to encounter what you never were so they can understand what you truly were. He allows them to feel instability so they can recognize the stability you provided. He allows them to taste indifference so they can remember your care. And this contrast is not cruelty, it is awakening, because some lessons cannot be taught through words, they must be felt through loss. And when someone repeatedly ignores gentle correction, life becomes the louder teacher. Your absence becomes a mirror reflecting their choices back to them, and in that reflection they must confront the truth that perhaps they misjudged you, perhaps they underestimated you, perhaps they projected their own fears and insecurities onto you, and perhaps they never realized that what they treated as ordinary was actually extraordinary. Sometimes the greatest sermon you will ever preach is your silence. Sometimes the strongest statement you will ever make is your withdrawal. And sometimes the most loving thing God can do for both of you is to create space. Do not mistake this process for weakness, because walking away when you still care requires immense strength. It requires trusting that God is working even when you cannot see immediate results. It requires believing that your worth is not determined by someone else's recognition, and it requires surrendering the outcome to a higher wisdom that sees beyond temporary emotions. When God removes you, He is not diminishing your value, He is preserving it, because there are environments where your light was being dimmed, where your compassion was being exploited, where your loyalty was being tested beyond healthy limits, and rather than allowing bitterness to grow inside you, God creates distance so that healing can begin on both sides. While you are healing and rediscovering your own identity, they are learning what life feels like without the grace you once extended so freely. There is a divine pattern in separation, a sacred rhythm in the breaking apart of what was once close, and often the lesson being taught is not only about appreciating you but about confronting themselves. When you are no longer there to absorb their frustration, to smooth over their mistakes, to provide emotional security, they are left alone with their own reflection, and that reflection can be uncomfortable, because it reveals impatience, pride, inconsistency, or emotional immaturity that was easier to ignore when you were present, cushioning the impact. Your absence removes distractions and exposes truth, and truth is the beginning of transformation. God is less concerned with temporary comfort and more concerned with eternal growth, and sometimes growth requires loss. You may wonder if they will ever understand, if realization will ever come, if regret will ever surface, but that is not your responsibility anymore. Your responsibility is obedience to the season God has placed you in, and if this is a season of distance, then embrace it with faith. Understand that lessons planted by absence take time to mature, because human pride resists immediate admission of fault. But over time, as patterns repeat and consequences accumulate, the memory of what you offered will resurface, and in quiet moments they may begin to connect the dots, seeing how your presence once balanced their chaos, how your encouragement once lifted their doubts, how your honesty once kept them grounded, and how your love once provided safety they did not know how to cherish. There is also another layer to this divine teaching, one that is not only about them but also about you, because while God is teaching them through your absence, He is teaching you through their absence as well. He is teaching you that you are not responsible for fixing everyone, that love does not mean tolerating disrespect, that patience does not mean self-neglect, and that loyalty does not mean losing yourself. He is strengthening your boundaries, refining your discernment, deepening your trust in Him rather than in unstable human behavior. What feels like loss is often protection, what feels like rejection is often redirection, and what feels like abandonment is often divine alignment shifting you towards something healthier. Sometimes we pray for change in others, and God answers by changing our proximity to them. Sometimes we ask God to soften their heart, and instead He hardens the situation so that both hearts must confront truth. And sometimes we beg God to restore something, but before restoration can occur, revelation must come, because without revelation, cycles repeat. Your absence interrupts the cycle, it disrupts complacency. It forces reflection, and even if pride delays acknowledgement, seeds of awareness are being planted in places you cannot see. Do not underestimate what silence can accomplish when guided by divine intention. You are not losing by stepping back. You are allowing space for accountability. You are allowing God to do what you could never do through argument or persuasion. You are allowing natural consequences to speak, and in that space, transformation becomes possible. Some relationships will return stronger, built on newfound respect and understanding, while others will fade permanently because the lesson required permanent separation. Either way, God remains sovereign, weaving outcomes that serve growth rather than ego. If they are meant to walk beside you again, it will not be because you begged or convinced them, it will be because they have learned, because humility has replaced pride, because awareness has replaced ignorance, because gratitude has replaced entitlement. And if they do not return, trust that the lesson was still fulfilled, because sometimes the teaching is not about reconciliation but about closure. Sometimes God uses your absence to close a chapter that was draining your spirit, and in doing so He prepares you for connections that recognize your value from the beginning rather than after losing you. So stand firm in the quiet season, resist the urge to break silence out of fear, resist the temptation to prove your worth to someone who once overlooked it, trust that the same God who orchestrates beginnings also governs endings, trust that absence guided by divine wisdom is never wasted, and understand deeply that when God removes you from someone's life, He is not erasing your impact. He is magnifying it in a way presence never could. What they failed to see up close, they may finally understand from afar. What they dismissed as ordinary, they may eventually recognize as rare, and what they once assumed would always remain may become the very thing they missed the most. Through your absence, God is speaking, correcting, awakening, and teaching lessons that words alone could never accomplish, and while the process may feel lonely at times, it is purposeful, it is intentional, and it is ultimately leading both hearts toward a deeper understanding of value, responsibility, and divine design. Even when you cannot see immediate change, even when it feels as if your absence has gone unnoticed, something is shifting beneath the surface because divine lessons are rarely loud at first. They unfold slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, like roots growing underground before a tree ever breaks through the soil, and just because they are not reaching out, apologizing, or acknowledging your worth right away does not mean the realization is not forming in hidden corners of their heart. Sometimes pride stands guard at the door of confession, sometimes ego delays admission, sometimes stubbornness masks regret, but time has a way of softening what arrogance once hardened, and distance has a way of clarifying what proximity once blurred. When you were constantly there, your sacrifices blended into routine, your love felt automatic, your patience seemed endless. And they mistook your consistency for something common, but now that the rhythm of your presence is gone, the silence where your voice once echoed becomes impossible to ignore. There will be ordinary moments that unexpectedly remind them of you, small situations where they instinctively think of how you would have responded, times when they face challenges and realize you were the one who brought calm to chaos, or when they search for the reassurance you once gave so effortlessly and discover that not everyone carries the same depth of understanding. Comparison begins subtly, almost unconsciously, and through that comparison comes awareness. They may try to distract themselves, to convince themselves they are unaffected, to surround themselves with noise to drown out the quiet truth. But truth has a persistent way of resurfacing, especially when God is the one guiding the lesson. Your absence becomes a reference point, a measuring stick against which other interactions are silently evaluated, and gradually the gap between what they have now and what they once had with you becomes more visible. Yet this process is not about inflating your ego or feeding a desire for validation. It is about divine justice and spiritual maturity. God is not interested in humiliating them but in humbling them, not in shaming them but in shaping them. because sometimes people misuse blessings not out of cruelty but out of ignorance, and ignorance can only be corrected through experience. When they experience inconsistency after having known your reliability, when they experience emotional distance after having known your warmth, when they experience indifference after having known your care, the contrast becomes a teacher more powerful than any argument you could have made. They may begin to see patterns in their own behavior, recognizing how often they dismissed your concerns, how often they assumed you would always understand, how often they relied on your strength without offering equal support. And in that recognition lies the beginning of accountability. Meanwhile, as God works on their awareness, He is also strengthening your resilience. Absence is not only a lesson for them but a refining fire for you. It teaches you how to detach without bitterness, how to love without clinging, how to release without resentment. It teaches you that your value is intrinsic, not dependent on applause or acknowledgement. It reminds you that you were never meant to beg for reciprocity, never meant to shrink yourself to maintain connection, never meant to carry emotional weight that was never yours to begin with. In stepping back, you reclaim pieces of yourself that may have been quietly eroding under the pressure of trying to hold everything together. You rediscover your boundaries, your voice, your strength. You realize that you can survive distance, that you can thrive in solitude, that you can trust God even when outcomes remain uncertain. There may be nights when you question whether walking away was the right decision, moments when loneliness tempts you to break the silence, to send the message, to reopen the door, but remember that divine timing cannot be rushed without disrupting the lesson. If you return too soon, if you fill the space prematurely, the growth that was beginning to form may collapse under familiarity again. Patience is part of the process. Restraint is part of the wisdom. Sometimes loving someone means allowing them to feel what life is like without you long enough for understanding to take root. This is not manipulation. It is surrender. It is trusting that if something is meant to be restored, it will return transformed, not simply resumed as before. And if transformation does occur, it will reveal itself not through grand declarations but through consistent change. Humility will replace defensiveness, listening will replace dismissal, effort will replace complacency, respect will replace entitlement, because when someone truly learns the value of what they almost lost, their behavior shifts naturally. They do not need to be reminded of your worth because they have felt the void created by your absence. They no longer take lightly what once felt ordinary. They approach the connection with deeper gratitude and greater awareness, and in that renewed dynamic, both of you stand on more stable ground, having grown through separation rather than being destroyed by it. But there is also the possibility that the lesson leads them in a different direction, one where understanding comes too late for reconciliation, and that too is part of divine design. Sometimes realization does not guarantee reunion. Sometimes growth prepares both people for separate paths, and that does not invalidate what was shared. It simply means the purpose of the connection was seasonal. Some relationships are classrooms, not lifetimes. They exist to teach specific truths, to awaken certain strengths, to reveal hidden weaknesses, and once the lesson is complete, continuation is no longer necessary. If this is the outcome, trust that God is not removing something good from you but making space for something aligned more deeply with your future. In all of this, remember that your absence is not a weapon but a boundary, not a punishment but a protection, not an act of spite but an act of faith. You are not withdrawing love, you are withdrawing access. Love can remain in your heart without granting unlimited availability. Sometimes the most powerful shift happens when you stop trying to convince someone of your worth and allow life itself to reveal it. And whether they return transformed or remain distant with newfound awareness, the truth remains that your value did not diminish in their misunderstanding. It remained constant, it remained real, it remained worthy of recognition. So continue walking forward with quiet confidence. Let God handle what you cannot control. Let time unveil what you cannot force. Let absence complete the work that presence could not, because when God is teaching someone through your absence, He is orchestrating lessons far beyond surface emotions, lessons about gratitude, accountability, humility, and love, and in the end, whether the story circles back or closes permanently, you will stand stronger, clearer, and more aligned with your purpose, knowing that you trusted divine wisdom over temporary comfort and allowed space to become the teacher that words never could. As time continues to move forward, something even deeper begins to unfold, because when God teaches through absence, He is not only addressing behavior, He is confronting identity. He is challenging the version of them that felt secure in taking you lightly. The version that believed love would remain no matter how carelessly it was handled. The version that assumed your patience had no limits and your loyalty required no maintenance. And when that assumption collapses under the weight of reality, a profound internal shift becomes possible. They are forced to ask themselves difficult questions they once avoided, questions about why they acted the way they did, why they struggled to reciprocate, why they resisted vulnerability, why they hesitated to fully honor what they were given. And in that questioning, awareness slowly transforms into conviction. Conviction begins to reshape character, and character determines future choices. There may come a moment when they recognize that your absence was not random but consequential, not dramatic but necessary, and that recognition can feel both humbling and unsettling, because it exposes how easily something precious can be lost through neglect. They may replay scenarios in their mind where they could have responded differently, moments where they chose ego over empathy, silence over communication, pride over partnership. Regret has a way of illuminating truth with sharp clarity. And while regret can be painful, it can also be redemptive. It can motivate change, inspire growth, and dismantle patterns that once seemed unshakable. But that process requires courage, because admitting that you misjudged someone requires dismantling the narrative you once defended so strongly. At the same time, your journey is evolving into something steadier and more self-assured. Distance has given you perspective. It has allowed you to see where you overextended yourself, where you ignored subtle red flags, where you compromised pieces of your own peace in the name of maintaining harmony. God is not only teaching them through your absence, He is teaching you through the quiet strength that comes from not chasing what fails to cherish you. You begin to understand that love should not feel like constant negotiation, that respect should not require repeated reminders, that effort should not be one-sided. This clarity becomes a shield, protecting your future from repeating the past. There is a sacred discipline in not interfering with the lesson. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is nothing, to resist sending the text when nostalgia hits, to resist checking in when curiosity whispers, to resist reopening doors that God deliberately closed. But every time you choose restraint, you reaffirm trust in divine orchestration. You affirm that you believe growth is more important than immediate comfort. And in that discipline, your own character strengthens. You become less reactive and more rooted, less anxious and more anchored. You begin to rely on God not as a last resort but as your first source of security. If transformation is truly happening on their side, it will reveal itself in subtle but undeniable ways. Maturity carries a different tone, humility sounds different, accountability feels different, there is less defensiveness and more reflection, less blame and more ownership. When someone has genuinely learned through loss, they approach connection with reverence rather than entitlement. They move carefully, aware of how fragile trust can be. They no longer assume permanence, they value consistency because they have experienced its absence, and if that change aligns with your growth, restoration can emerge as something healthier than what existed before. However, there is equal strength in accepting when growth leads in separate directions. Sometimes the lesson is about teaching them how to value people properly in the future, even if that future does not include you. Sometimes your role was to awaken something in them that another season will benefit from. That truth can feel bittersweet, but it does not diminish your significance. Impact is not measured solely by duration. Sometimes the most powerful influences are temporary yet transformative, and if your absence becomes the catalyst that shifts their mindset permanently, then your presence was never wasted. Ultimately, when God teaches through your absence, He is demonstrating a principle that echoes across life. What is not appreciated is eventually removed, not out of cruelty, but out of divine balance. Blessings mishandled are paused, opportunities misused are reconsidered, and connections taken for granted are tested. Your absence is not an act of revenge. It is a reflection of value. It is a reminder that love requires stewardship, that relationships require intention, that hearts require care, and whether the lesson results in reconciliation or release, the deeper truth remains that God does not allow sincere love to be continuously dishonored without intervention. So continue forward without bitterness, without arrogance, without the need to monitor their progress. What God is doing does not require your supervision. Trust that seeds planted in silence will bloom in their own time. Trust that clarity will reach them in moments you will never witness. And trust that your obedience to step back when instructed has already positioned you for greater peace. Because when the lesson is complete, one of two things will happen: either they will return transformed, carrying a humility shaped by absence, or you will move ahead into a future where your value is recognized without having to be proven. And in both outcomes, you win, not because someone else loses, but because you aligned yourself with divine wisdom over emotional impulse. In the end, absence guided by God is never empty. It is filled with unseen work, silent revelations, and slow but powerful transformation. It teaches them what words could not explain, and it teaches you what attachment once obscured. It refines hearts, exposes truth, strengthens boundaries, and clarifies purpose. And long after the initial separation fades into memory, the lesson will remain etched in both of you, shaping how love is given, how respect is maintained, and how blessings are handled. Through your absence, God is writing a story of growth that neither of you could have authored alone, and when that story fully unfolds, it will reveal that what felt like loss was actually instruction, what felt like silence was actually communication, and what felt like an ending was simply the beginning of deeper understanding.